My name is Mendez. So for my book report, I chose the book When Montezuma Met Cortes by Matthew Restall. I chose this book because I've always heard the story of the Spanish conquering the Aztecs, but I never questioned how true it actually was. And then this book takes that famous story and like flips it. So this is Matthew Restall. So he is a historian who focuses on Latin America, especially Mexico and the Maya. He's a professor at Penn State and has his PhD. He has written a bunch of books that try to tell history from a perspective that isn't just the European ones. A summary. So in the book, Montezuma Met Cortes breaks down the classical story that we have all heard about the Spanish conquest. How Cortes showed up with a few men and Montezuma thought he was a god and then just handed over his empire. Well, Ristal basically says that story is all fake. It was written by the Spanish after everything happened, trying to make themselves look better. The real truth is that Montezuma wasn't weak, he was just trying to protect his people and avoid chaos. And also, Cortes didn't do it alone. He had tens of thousands of indigenous allies who were already enemies of the Aztecs. And this book focuses on how history is shaped by who tells the story and how most of what we've learned comes from Spanish lies or exaggerations. How history gets told. So, in class, we have talked a lot along the lines about how history is shaped by power, who tells the story, and what they leave out. This book shows how the Spanish created a version of the conquest that made them look like heroes. Ristal states the following: The conquest is not a story of a few brave Spaniards defeating a mighty empire, it is a story of a prolonged violence and, messy process. This shows how history isn't black and white and that the truth gets lost when only one side gets to speak on it. Erasing indigenous perspectives. One thing that really stood out to me was how the Spanish completely changed the way people saw Montezuma and the Aztecs. We've watched videos in class where we saw how colonizers erased native cultures and replaced them with their own narratives. Ristal states the idea that Montezuma saw Cortes as a god was a post-conquest invention, not a reflection of Aztec belief. This shows how the Spanish used lies to make it seem like they were destined to win when really they just wrote the story that way to make them look better and so that people weren't hating on them. Reclaiming the narrative. Ristal's book plays a crucial role in reclaiming the narrative of the Spanish conquest by shifting the focus away from the glorified image of Cortes and towards the often erased perspectives of indigenous people. He challenges the traditional story that presents Montezuma as passive and Cortes as a brilliant conqueror, showing instead that Montezuma made um, strategic decisions based on the complexity he faced. As Ristal writes, the story we tell ourselves about the conquest has less to do with what actually happened and more to do with the needs of the people telling it. This approach helps decolonize historical storytelling and exposes how the dominant narrative has long served the interest of colonizers rather than the truth, highlighting the importance of examining who gets to shape history and why. Changing how we see ourselves. The book makes you rethink how Chicanos or Chicanas are connected to indigenous history. Instead of showing indigenous people as weak, it shows they had power and made decisions. That helps Chicanos or Chicanas see their roots as strong and smart, not just victims. It doesn't reinforce stereotypes, it actually pushes back against them, and it makes you question who's been telling the story and why. Why I chose this book. I chose this book because I've always been interested in how history is told, especially from different perspectives. The idea of challenging the traditional conquest narrative caught my attention. I don't have a direct personal connection to the events in the book, but it made me think more about how historical stories shape our identities. The book's focus on how indigenous voices was important, especially since those voices are often left out of mainstream history. It's made me more aware of how much history is about perspective and who gets to write it. This is the collage. This is the pictures that I chose. I felt like this kind of represented more of like Aztecs, and then this is like, I don't know, like the first one here to the left can be like them seeing him like Cortez as like a god and like he's like giving up everything. And then the middle one is like a map of like basically just showing like all the places of like that Cortez like would go, or like where like his like trail and stuff. What I learned and what I would do differently, I found um I found when Montezuma met Cortez to be an eye-opening read that challenged traditional historical narratives. I learned how much of history is shaped by perspective, especially when it comes to indigenous people and their role in the conquest. While I would probably just choose a different book if I were to do it again, I still found this one interesting, especially because it focuses on challenging like myths and reclaiming history. It made me more aware of how history is told and how those stories influence our views today.